When anticipating the Thanksgiving meal itself, most of us are fearful of two things: eating too much and what to do with all the leftovers. Now, some folk try to compensate by fitting in an extra workout to feel less guilty about the weekend's indulgence. Others embrace the indulgence and are already planning how to make the most of their turkey and mashed potato palooza by mapping out the turkey sandwiches and chili they're going to enjoy for the rest of the week. Some folk are hosts, others are guests. Some families have to bounce around to 2 or 3 or more big family dinners in order to appease all the relatives. Just break out your stretchy pants. But of all the things that cross our minds surrounding Thanksgiving, it is likely that "I'm going to go hungry" isn't one of them. What would you do for a loaf of bread? Food insecurity is a problem around the world. The UN estimates that the number of undernourished people in the world has reached 821 million in 2018. That means 1 in 9 people do not get enough food to be healthy and lead an active life. Greater than AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined, hunger and malnutrition are the #1 risk to health worldwide. Food insecurity is a lack of access, for whatever reason, to enough good, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. And while your mind, I'm sure, immediately went to parts of Africa, rest assured, Canada is not immune. 1 in 8 households in Canada, 1 in 8, is food insecure, amounting to over 4 million Canadians, including almost 1.2 million children, living in homes that consistently struggle to put food on the table. Household food insecurity is especially concerning in Nunavut, which has the highest prevalence of food insecurity in all of the provinces and territories. Almost half of the households there are food insecure. Here in Halton, a recent health indicator report found that as of 2015, 7% of Halton households were food insecure. Folks, this isn't just skipping a meal, right? There are people in our region who do not have resources to access enough good, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. Some might be in our congregation right now. The working poor, the newcomer to Canada, the single parent, the senior, food insecurity has many faces. In 2019, this blew my mind. In 2019, the average weekly cost of a basic healthy diet for a family of 4 living in Halton was $230 weekly. And that number has increased by 71% since 2003. So this is actually reflective of the finding that in North America, the causes for food insecurity are most often socioeconomic. In other parts of the world, of course, war, drought, famine, those are the root causes of food insecurity. Many refugees and migrants leave their home country because of human rights and safety for their family, and we know that access to food and water is a basic human right. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. Did you know that Bethlehem means house of bread? There was a famine in the house of bread. What would you do for a loaf of bread? There was a famine in the land, and a certain man stole a loaf of bread to feed his sister's children. This is the premise for Victor Hugo's classic novel, Les Miserables. Writing in a time of extreme poverty and hunger in the land, Hugo's inspiration came from an actual event that he witnessed when a starving man was arrested for stealing bread. Would you steal bread if your family was starving? In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. There was a famine in the land, and countless men from Ireland, in desperation to feed their families, made the dangerous journey across the Atlantic Ocean to seek refuge in North America, to find bread. In the mid-1800s, a disease wiped out the potato crops of Ireland. Potatoes were their staple food and foundational to their economy. Starvation and disease claimed around 1 million lives from 1845 to 1850, which led almost twice that number to sail to other countries, including Canada and the US. If your family was dying of starvation, would you leave Ontario or even Canada in order to feed your family, your children, and yourself? What would you do for a loaf of bread? There was a famine in the land. Famines are game changers. In the pre-industrial era, agrarian societies were incredibly vulnerable to famine when crops failed. There were no Whole Foods or Fortinos back then, which is where my children go to do all their farming. And famines happen a lot across the scriptures. In fact, I'm kind of shocked we don't talk about it more often. There are records of at least 13 famines in Scripture. Most famous, of course, is the famine that drove Jacob and his family out of Canaan into Egypt, where his long-lost son, Joseph, of Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat fame, had been helping as second in command to Pharaoh, and Joseph's primary job, storing up food for the 7-year famine that would soon hit Egypt. Famines are game changers. Food insecurity is a shape shifter. What would you do for a loaf of bread? Would you steal? Would you cross oceans and borders? Would you take up a new life on different soil, even among your enemies? Have you ever thought about it? In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. How desperate was Elimelech that he would take his wife and 2 young boys, break the law, leave his hometown and country, cross a border, and seek refuge among a forbidden foreign people. Can you even fathom being that desperate? But that storyline plays out still today, all over the world, as men and women, seniors and children risk fleeing their countries with the hope of finding bread and safety in another land. Ask any of the Syrian refugees that we know. Read up on the migrants detained at the borders in the US. Ask the families in South Sudan and Somalia, Nigeria and Yemen, and in 9 additional countries across Africa and into the Middle East. There was a famine in the land of Judah, and in the house of bread in Bethlehem lived a man and his family who somehow came to the decision that fleeing and seeking refuge among neighboring enemies would be a better fate than staying home and slowly starving to death. They traveled by foot 100 miles overland. They crossed political and geographical borders. They sought a place where they could eat, live, raise a family. They went to Moab. Now, the Moabites are distant cousins of the Jews, but there is no love between them. Indeed, in the traditions of ancient Israel, Moabites are notoriously suspect. The biblical story of the origin of the Moabites, you're going to love this, told in Genesis 19, verse 30 to 38, I do not make this up, traces their lineage to a drunken, incestuous encounter between Lot and one of his daughters, following the destruction of Sodom. That's where the Moabites come from. In Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and 4, it's declared that no Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Moabites were to be avoided. It was against the law to live amongst them, to make friends with them, to trade with them, and definitely one ought not marry one. Campfire stories in Judah told of the danger of Moabite women. They'll seduce you, you know, and soon they'll have you sucked into their culture, worshiping their gods. Avoid them at all costs. They're bad news. I wonder if he had lived long enough, if Elimelech would have stopped his sons, both of his sons, from marrying Moabite women. Perhaps Naomi resisted at first, maybe, or maybe she learned in her time among the Moabites they were not the villains that her people had made them out to be. Who knows? On the other hand, I wonder if the Moabites resisted marrying their daughters to Israelite men. Or I wonder if the Moabites were gracious hosts to the migrants in their midst and welcomed the marriages. Who knows? Just speculating. What we do know is that shortly after their marriages, the sons go into the earth alongside their father, leaving 3 women, widowed and childless. This is a tragedy. And before you think that they could just turn to their neighbors or some kind of local social service, Kerr Street mission of Moabite land, you've got to understand that the gossip around the well would have been that Naomi and her family were cursed by God. Why else would such a tragedy befall them? And so rather than helping them, most people would have been avoiding them like the plague so as to not contract whatever curse they had. They weren't getting help from neighbors and friends. But if they don't do something soon, they're going to starve to death. So Naomi makes the difficult choice. Go back to the house of bread. She had caught wind that the famine had ended there, and the risk seemed worth it. And at first she allows Orpah and Ruth to go with her, but likely with each step, she realized the fear and resistance their arrival would bring in Judah. Moabite women would not be welcome in Bethlehem. So she urges her daughters-in-law to go return to their own families. Perhaps it wasn't too late for them to marry again and bear children yet. Her words bring them all to tears. They had forged a deep bond. Orpah made the gut-wrenching decision to do what she was told, to follow Naomi's command. Tears streaming down her face, she kissed her mother-in-law and turned her face back to Moab. But Ruth clings to Naomi, which should have been our first clue. You see, in the parenting world, I think we'd call someone like Ruth spirited, to put it nicely. She's resilient, loyal, intelligent, determined, perhaps even stubborn. She actually reminds me of Anne of Green Gables. And now that I've said that, you can't unsee it. L.M. Montgomery could have written these words, Anne clinging desperately to Matthew and Marilla, "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so more to me, even if death parts me from you. Hand this woman an Oscar. And then I love the next line. Connie, it wasn't in the reading, so Connie didn't read it, but it says, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. What else can you do? When you're dealing with one of these spirited ones, you just learn to save your breath and pick your battles. Naomi caves to Ruth's fiery determination, and they carry on to Bethlehem. I want you to go home and read Ruth, imagining her as Anne. It works. But her welcome wasn't warm. Even after her declaration of fealty to Naomi and to the people of Israel and to their God, Ruth is continually identified as a Moabite for the whole story. We don't do that to any other character in the Bible. We don't constantly refer to the Apostle Paul as Paul the African. We don't say Jesus the Jew, but it's Ruth the Moabite throughout the whole book. She is always seen as an outsider, always seen as the other, the enemy even. We read her story as a heroine that has come in, has found love, and saves the lineage of her family. But from the community's perspective, she was an outsider who infiltrated their people. Would she seduce and convert Boaz? Has she already snaked her beliefs into Naomi's mind? She would not have been looked upon favorably. And we can catch glimpses of that, actually, when Boaz instructs her to glean from his field, lest she come up against trouble elsewhere. He even has to instruct his own men to leave her alone and not cause her any grief. That assumes there was something to be worried about. Boaz, it turns out, saw something in her beyond her ethnicity and her status as a migrant. He saw her humanity, her dignity, her resilience, her loyalty. She wasn't just a Moabite to him. She was Ruth. Well, you know the story, how it goes. Well, you think you know the story. It's actually quite scandalous, and Ruth is, we'll say, unfathomably bold and fearless. Maybe someday I'll be brave enough to tell you about it. Let's just say laying at Boaz's feet is a biblical euphemism, and I'll leave it at that. But in the end, the two of them end up together, and they conceive a son. Naomi turns from mourning into rejoicing, and the author even did us a service of letting us know that their union eventually begets King David himself, which means it's also Jesus' lineage. Ruth the Moabitess is in Jesus' family tree. God worked through a foreigner, someone looked down upon by the people of God. A determined woman who's willing to leave her people, glean the fields, and take brave, bold steps on behalf of herself and her mother-in-law. And to think it all started with a famine in Bethlehem, the house of bread, that forced a family to flee in hopes of finding food. People all over the world are still willing to take great risks to find food for themselves and their families. They take risks knowing that they will be perceived and received in a light of mistrust and cynicism and fear. Will they come here and take our jobs? Will they marry our children? Will they infiltrate us with their religion and culture? I've heard these questions asked in 2019. Elimelech and his family faced those questions when they arrived in Moab after fleeing a famine. Ruth later faced those same questions when she migrated to Bethlehem. People face those fear-driven questions today still. But brothers and sisters, can you see the good news? God doesn't ask any of those questions. God worked through the famine God worked through the migration of families, through a determined widowed Moabitess, and through her, God brought forth the King of Israel and the King of Kings, David and Jesus, both born in Bethlehem, the house of bread. I am the bread of life, said the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Ruth, the Moabite. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. What wouldn't we do for that bread? And aren't we all, in the end, regardless of wealth or status, just spiritual beggars looking for bread and telling one another where to find it? As you enjoy your Thanksgiving meal, remember and consider what you might do for a loaf of bread. To God be all the glory. Amen.